All right. So we looked at the triadic model last time, and I applied it to fascism. I do want to take a shot at it. How might we think of the triadic model and apply it to Nazism? And I think really the big difference here is an even more virulent commitment to racial hierarchy than you would see even in maybe Italian fascism. Right. So obvious basing of the view of justice on a conception of racial hierarchy within the Nazi regime. So the hero of this story is the German Volk, or the German people, represented by a racially purified state. Right. And the objective then, or the obstacle then, would be any defined impurity. And notoriously, German Jews and then Jews in Europe beyond German borders were defined as that impurity, right? And the result of that is, of course, the more than 6 million Jews who were murdered. They weren't the only ones, but they were certainly the bulk of the victims in terms of carrying out this triadic view of Nazi, we got to put big quotations around it, justice. So the goal was to realize this racial purity and a supremacy of the German nation and create a 1,000-year Reich. And ended up being more like a 12-year Reich, right? So this is how I would apply the triadic model, right? And then just a little reminder there in the right corner about how the sort of fanaticism and ecstatic sensibility was generated to get people who would, you'd think they were good people, right? I think you might have dinner with these people, average German, and think this is just kind of normal person. To get people like that to go along, you really do need to introduce some ecstasy-producing events, and that the Nuremberg rallies and other type efforts to unify the German Volk around these kinds of policies and get ordinary men and women to do things that in other circumstances they wouldn't have done is an aspect of all of this. And that should produce some I mentioned humility last time in relation to Western civilization and this type of politics emerging from the heart of Western civilization. This sort of thing should also cause us as individuals some level of humility in thinking, we're probably all people who think, well, if I was there, I would never have gone along with all of this stuff. And that question's actually unanswerable. But we should have some level of humility just in the knowledge that so many ordinary Americans did, in fact, go along and probably thought themselves good people prior and during that period of time. So we said before, just a little earlier, we were thinking in terms of emerging fascism and what might be some signals that your country, your nation is traveling down that road. And but with the election of Trump, this it wasn't produced because of that, but with the election of Trump, this list did start making the rounds. And I think it's useful, not as a strict and sort of systematic identification of what fascism requires, but it's useful as sort of a rule of thumb and as a conversation starter in terms of what you might see in a society that is traveling down that path, or has perhaps traveled a good deal down that path. So here are some of the early warning signs of fascism. And again, don't maybe thinking in terms of what that might look like in our modern setting versus maybe the German setting in 1933, it would be useful to keep in the back of your mind as well. So early warning signs, a powerful and continuing nationalism obviously would be an indicator. Growing disdain for human rights, identification of enemies as a unifying cause, and I think those can be internal or external, probably both. A supremacy of the military as a dominant institution in that society, with reverence towards that set of institution in that society. Rampant sexism, control of the mass media, an obsession with national security, religion and government becoming more and more intertwined, corporate power protected above other interests, labor power being suppressed, certainly in relation to corporate power, growing disdain for intellectuals and the arts, an obsession with crime and punishment, rampant cronyism and corruption, and then fraudulent elections. These would all be indicators of what's going on. And again, it's not the case that all of these would have to be present for you to become concerned, and it might be that they unfold in ways that are unexpected, right? All right, questions about any of that, or thoughts about any of that, anything you see on this list? Okay. So I guess maybe it's time to kind of think about this question. How dangerous is the reactionary movement in the United States? And here, this is a picture of part of the January 6th, 2021 insurrection at the Capitol, which was a culmination of events after the November 2020 election, of efforts by the Trump administration to overturn the outcome of that election. So in November and December of 2020, after the election, those efforts included the spread of misinformation about fraudulent voting or fraudulent vote counting, and it involved pressure on various state officials, especially in swing states, that if turned could alter the outcome of the election. So Biden won the popular vote by 7 million votes, which is a lot, right? But he didn't win by a lot in the Electoral College, or at least if you took away a few states that were very, very close, it could have easily gone the other way in the same way that the popular vote winner lost in 2016. So pressure on state officials to find votes or alter the election count in some way in Arizona, in Georgia, and elsewhere could have swung the election the other way. So that was going on, and then that of course drives up a fervor on the right behind the opinion that the election had been stolen, and again the culmination was this January 6th insurrection. So my question, after that framing, and maybe any knowledge you have of all this yourself, is how dangerous is all of this? What's do you have thoughts on this? Probably a lot, but maybe they're not all collected and ready to go today. But any thoughts on that you want to share?
I
Owen?
earlier about that sort of inching towards one step at a time towards fascism. This sort of movement opens a door, right? And I think what strengthens something like that, and I speak from personal experience because my family tends to be very right-wing, but I don't view my family as, foolish or anything. I just think that what strengthens people's opinions is a contradiction. And so I think that this sort of opens a door, and once you're a little bit of the way in, it immediately gets solidified by saying, oh, people are going to say this, people are going to say that, but they're wrong for these reasons.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, in the background, something we were talking about before I turned the recording on for this part of the lecture, we were talking about people, and last time during the lecture, I offered up the notion that people have things to complain about. It's not like all of this happened in a vacuum and suddenly people are driven crazy by some, megalomaniac who is able to harness their day's activities. Right? No, the living standard of the middle class in the United States has been stagnant or falling for many people. People find their place on the economic ladder, on the socioeconomic ladder, under threat for one reason or another. And in that kind of context, it's easier for a would-be demagogue or party of demagogues to attract their support and to get them really angry and distrustful about mainstream institutions. And with regard to those institutions, there are reasons to have that mistrust. Right? So if you think about our major media institutions, there are many things we can say about them. I'll just point out that it was 20 years ago, next month, that the country was essentially lied into war in Iraq. And the paper of record, New York Times, and other mainstream institutions were all part of that. So there's reason, and beyond that, there's reason to have mistrust in mainstream institutions. Now, if you're a citizen out there and you kind of feel the insecurity and you feel like something's wrong and that the mainstream institutions are helping make it worse, again, it's easy for a demagogue to come along and to throw attention on immigrants, on other marginalized groups of people, to suggest conspiratorial cabals exist that are working against you, right? And with the onset of the pandemic, that became even more pronounced. The ease with which people can be convinced of these things in this kind of context becomes much more fluid or likely, right? Yeah.
I feel like something to add is sort of drawing a connection, somewhat of an analogy between, I think that calling people who are more right-wing, fascists, is just equally as extreme as calling your average Democrat a communist.
Or a woke Democrat, right? It might be the case that in many circumstances, when you're using the preferred language of slander of that day, that you're not being you're not contributing to a healthy dialogue, right? Even if you're angry at that time. At the same time, if you see someone acting in a fascistic manner, I think we should dust that word off and use it. But throwing it around relative to every single thing, for example, requiring mask wearing to fascism, seems a bit of a stretch, to say the least. And there are probably good examples aimed at the other direction as well. Yeah.
I think that this was really interesting because if we look at past protests, if you look at the civil rights movement, and they were all protests laws, that it was actually affecting them. You know, you look at Stonewall and all of this stuff, it was like real issues that were really present. And the fact that there was such a severe protest over emotions and thoughts and conspiracy rather than real issues is interesting that it got to such an extreme
Yeah.
level as
Yeah.
well, and it's concerning to see that that is what
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah. What's a little disconcerting, maybe a lot disconcerting, is that a lot of this was predicted well before anybody thought Donald Trump would run for president. So what I have on the board here is something written by one of the most well-known philosophers of the late 20th, early 21st century, Richard Rorty. I mean, he's right up there with some of the other philosophers that we talked about earlier in the quarter. So John Rawls, right? He's right up there with that guy. And he wrote a book called Achieving Our Country 25 years ago. And already at that point, it was clear that economics was moving in a certain direction, society was moving in a certain direction. I would categorize that as being in a neoliberal direction, whereby the average person's grip on a stable middle class life, working class's grip on a stable life was starting to recede, even 25 years ago. And so Rorty wrote this, and it's sort of chilling to hear what he thought might happen. So I want to read it to you. And I don't know that we have to have a discussion about it, but maybe think about it as we finish up here. But Rorty wrote in 1998, many writers on socioeconomic policy have warned that the old industrialized democracies are heading into a Weimar-like period, one in which populist moments are likely to overturn constitutional governments. Edward Luttwak, for example, has suggested that fascism may be in the American future. The point of his book, The Endangered American Dream, is that members of labor unions and unorganized, unskilled workers will sooner or later realize that their government is not even trying to prevent wages from sinking or to prevent jobs from being exported. Around the same time, they will realize that suburban white-collar workers, themselves desperately afraid of being downsized, are not going to let themselves be taxed to provide social benefits for anyone else. At that point, something will crack. The non-suburban electorate will decide that the system has failed and start looking around for a strongman to vote for. Someone willing to assure them that once he is elected, the smug bureaucrats, tricky lawyers, overpaid bond salesmen, and postmodernist professors will no longer be calling the shots. A scenario like that of Sinclair Lewis's novel, It Can't Happen Here, may then be played out. For once a strongman takes office, nobody can predict what will happen. In 1932, most of the predictions made about what would happen if Hindenburg named Hitler chancellor were wildly over-optimistic. One thing that is very likely to happen is that the gains made in the past 40 years by black and brown Americans and by homosexuals will be wiped out. Jocular contempt for women will come back into fashion. The N-word and kike will once again be heard in the workplace. All the sadism, which the academic left has tried to make unacceptable to its students, will come flooding back. All the resentment which badly educated Americans feel about having their manners dictated to them by college graduates will find an outlet. But such a renewal of sadism will not alter the effects of selfishness. For after my imagined strongman takes charge, he will quickly make his peace with the international super rich, just as Hitler made his with the German industrialists. He will invoke the glorious memory of the Gulf War to provoke military adventures which will generate short-term prosperity. He will be a disaster for the country and the world. Pretty prescient. Perhaps the fact that Donald Trump was not reelected, perhaps the fact that the 2022 midterm elections went a little less poorly than anticipated takes some of the concern off of what is said here. But nevertheless, I think this is quite a statement, having been made 25 years ago. Any thoughts or questions about this? Okay. Yeah, Owen.
To take this just a little bit, very current, looking at Trump and sort of what he was able to get done, and then looking at, what happens now, I wonder, what do you think specifically of DeSantis?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I probably have put too much of all this on Trump, right? I think the Republican Party was actually headed towards these kind of politics for decades, right? And some elements of the Democratic Party as well. But, it was Bill Clinton that did the welfare as we know it is over stuff, which made life really horrible for a lot of poor people. But Trump by no means has to be the one or the person that takes us further down the road. And I think DeSantis is actually a competent version of the same thing. And that's very worrying because he has a good chance of being the winner in 2024. We'll see how that plays out. But I think he, for all of Trump's bluster, he just didn't know a hell of a lot about what he was doing in office. And the real danger would be having somebody who does know how to work the mechanisms, the levers of government, and hold that office. Yeah. Now, while I've mentioned that fascism draws the average person in to a lot of these politics, these kinds of identitarian politics, politics of us and them. Let's not pretend like there aren't people who are looking forward to this and who actually think this is the right way for politics to go, right? So it's not just the average person who's a tool, it's also, for example, people who call themselves members of the alt-right, other language, white nationalists, who have emerged as important actors on the American political scene over the last 10 years. One interesting aspect of all of this is that you hear a lot of criticism of identity politics in American political conversations. And I think there are things that we can say about identity politics as practiced on the left, we can be critical of. Right? But we should also note that the right has been playing identity politics all along. What have we been talking about in directing ire towards immigrants or other marginalized group? That's identity politics and should be seen as such. In fact, the identity politics of the left is in reaction to the long-term identity politics of the right. In many ways, American history is about identity politics, right? With some people being on top and others on the bottom, right? But this particular sector of identitarian belief, the alt-right, is worth paying attention to, especially in relation to the question of fascism. So the alt-right, the term was coined by American neo-Nazi Richard Spencer. He, among other things, was famous for being slugged on an inaugural day on 2017, January 20th, 2017. One of the things I never thought I would have to, one of the discussions I never thought I would have to lead in a college classroom was the question of, is it okay to punch Nazis? Right? Because that's literally what happened to him while he was giving an interview on election day or inauguration day, January 20th, 2017. But that's who that guy is, in case you have seen that clip, right? What is it that people like Spencer believe? Well, first of all, they think that your identity, and specifically your racial or ethnic identity, is the core thing about you. That is what you are, right? And members of the alt-right claim to defend white or European identity. Now, they claim not to want to oppress others, but those others, if they remain in America, are expected to remain in a subordinate position. They try to draw from social psychology research that highlights the tribal nature of human beings. So they emphasize research that shows that people do find ways to divide themselves, right? Now, of course, they fail to take into account that it takes, an effort to raise the salience of race and ethnicity versus maybe some other things, other saliences that you could raise. For example, maybe we're all members of the working class, and so that's the way we group each other, rather than some of us are white, some of us are black, or something else, right? So that's a misuse, I would put it lightly, of this sort of social psychology. So the fact that they think that race and ethnicity is who you are, they think that it's simply natural to organize politics and the state around identities. And of course, they prefer that their mainstream identity be that which holds power. Right? And there's a sort of formula they think about that you see at the bottom here with regard to multiculturalism. Right? They see diversity plus closeness, proximity equals war. Right? Their view is that people with different skin colors or different ethnicities simply can't live with one another, despite all of your experiences to the contrary, right? Your personal experiences, no doubt. Now, last time I mentioned that fascism is unlikely to look like what you see on the History Channel, with all those black and white films and the silly Nazis kind of marching around Berlin. And the alt-right has tried to kind of make this come to pass, right? So you'll see them, they're not wearing brown shirts, they're not wearing Ku Klux Klan sheets and hoods. They're mostly trying to look respectable and wearing suits, right? And the goal amongst members of the alt-right is to make the sorts of viewpoints that I've articulated that they hold kind of mainstream beliefs. So that what we might label as normal politicians will start to use the language. Now, one illustration of this I would point to would be the sorts of commercials, political ads that were broadcast during the 2022 midterm that we just finished up last November. In particular, there was an ad that I'm not going to play it today since we're a little pressed for time, but if you want to click on this link right here, you can watch it, where it raises the specter of racism against whites, right? It really plays off of this sort of grievance politics, the type of a type that I've described being closely relevant to fascism, right? So that was a way of trying to introduce this into the mainstream of political conversation during the midterm elections that we just had. All right. So just as we finish up here, any final thoughts on how you would describe the current moment of American politics relative to the ideas we have considered? I think it's a moving target, and we're probably going to have to keep paying attention. and keep trying to figure out, well, okay, if you see something that is problematic, how might I contribute to leaning against it? And in many cases, this is going to be a matter of the eye of the beholder. So some of you might think that Trump was an absolute fascist. Some of you might think absolutely not, and it's absurd to call him that. But the politics by people not just called Donald Trump are what we should be paying attention to. What is the path we're on? Right? It's likely not to be one individual that drives the country in a bad direction. It's likely to be a kind of cultural shift that sends us down this path or further down the path. Any thoughts? Owen?
I have said for quite a long time now that I believe the greatest issue in politics is the just utter opposition between both parties. I think that this isn't due a lot to Trump and a push against the left and then an equal push right back.
Yeah, I think for all of you, I think with regard to your ages, your whole entire political lives have been lived in the context of kind of a radical polarization between the right and the left, or the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And so to the degree that people want unity, or think that that is possible in politics, a strong man comes around and promises to unify the country, that can be tempting, right? And at the same time, I would say, politics is about people pressing against other people who have different interests and intentions for the country, or for people in their position. Working class versus employers, for example, right? So I think it's important to realize that politics is unlikely to ever be about unification. And when it is, sometimes that's actually maybe a really bad thing, because maybe you're traveled down the road that we've articulated during this lecture. I think I'm going to stop there, and we'll move on to what I talked about at the start of class.